Two machinists' mates leaned against the crane rail at the edge of the yard, watching a stooped man haul a battered John boat hull across the gravel on a rented dolly, and one of them said he'd give the new contractor 10 minutes to run him off. The other said 5. The old man refuses every spring to let the yard simply replace his John boat's cracked hull, and refuses to say why. And today, of all days, with a colonel's evaluation board sitting in folding chairs inside the shop and a woman named Elise Northcott running a laser rig for them like a preacher running a tent revival, nobody expected him to make it past the gate. "Sir, this is a working evaluation floor, not a scrap drop," Northcott called out, not even turning from her display screen, the words landing before the old man had gotten the dolly's front wheel over the threshold. 40 words hadn't passed since he'd rounded the corner of the equipment shed, and already the tone of the day was set. If you have ever watched the world walk past someone carrying more history than the room could hold, you already know how this goes. In the next 6 minutes, a woman with a bonus riding on this contract will call this man a nuisance in front of a colonel. In the next 40, 10 decorated Navy frogmen will come to their feet at a single word out of his mouth. And in the next 3 days, a 50-year-old lie written to cover a cost-cutting shortcut will come apart because a dead woman filed a piece of paper exactly the way she wanted to, decades before anyone thought to look for it. None of that had happened yet. What had happened was an old man dragging a boat nobody asked him to bring, past 2 young sailors taking bets, into a shop that did not yet know what it owed him. The dolly's wheel caught on the seam between gravel and concrete, and the old man did not yank at it or curse. He simply set his feet, turned his whole body from the hip the way a door swings on a hinge, and walked the load forward until it rolled clear. One shoulder stayed low the entire time, tucked against his side like a folded wing, and he moved everything around that fixed point rather than through it. It did not read as an injury. It read as a decision made once, long ago, about how a body ought to be used and never revisited since. He wore coveralls the color of nothing in particular, gone gray-brown with age and river water, and across the back in cracked iron-on letters that had mostly given up their adhesive, a boatyard name that had not existed for 30 years, showed through like a bruise under skin. He carried, slung over one hip and never once set on the ground, a canvas roll tied with a leather thong, the kind of thing a man protects with his body before he protects his own head. When Rowan Gant, 6 months into his enlistment and still new enough to feel embarrassed on other people's behalf, offered to carry it for him, the old man said only, "I've got it." And that was the whole of the conversation. The boat itself was nothing to look at. A John boat hull, aluminum, patched twice already along a seam that ran the length of its port side, hauled in on the same rented dolly every spring for longer than anyone currently working the yard had been alive. He never asked for a new one. The yard's own supply chain could have handed him a replacement hull in an afternoon, and every spring somebody offered, and every spring he said no in the same unhurried way, and hauled the same boat back out when the work was done. On the back shelf of the shop, behind 2 decades of surplus fasteners nobody had catalogued, sat a battered tin ledger box with a hasp lock long since rusted open. Nobody remembered exactly when it had arrived there, or whose hand had first set it down, though the newer sailors assumed it held nothing but old invoices. It hadn't been opened in 11 years. It would not need opening today, not yet, but it was there on the shelf the whole time, the way a held breath is there before anyone notices they've stopped breathing, waiting on a name that used to keep it in order. Northcott's laser rig threw a green line the length of the hull she was testing, and it walked the seam like a scalpel following a scar, calling out numbers to 2 decimal places while the evaluation board watched from folding chairs set up along the shop wall. She was good at this. Whatever else would be said about her before the week was over, nobody in that room could say she didn't know her instrument. She narrated her own readings aloud without being asked, the way a woman does when she has learned that confidence sells better than modesty, and when the rig cleared a weld with a clean tone, she smiled at the board like she'd personally guaranteed the boat's next 50 years on the water. 0.31 millimeters of tolerance, gentlemen, and that's before we've even touched the bonding agent, she said, tapping the wall-mounted schedule board behind her with one knuckle, a habit she had of making a small percussive point whenever she wanted the room to remember what she'd just said. This is what modern maintenance looks like. Not, and here she turned finally, toward the old man wrestling his dolly through the bay doors. Whatever that is. The board laughed. Not unkindly exactly, just the easy laugh of people who assume the joke has already been vetted by someone smarter than them. Northcott let it land a beat longer than it needed to, then gestured at Orville with the flat of her hand like she was clearing a table. "Sir, if you're here to drop off scrap, that's a different building. This floor is reserved for the evaluation." She said it the second time with the exact words she'd used getting off the phone with Base Logistics that morning, when she'd learned an unscheduled walk-in had been logged at the gate, a nuisance clogging the shop floor on the one day she needed it clean. She had not expected the nuisance to have a face yet, an old man's face, patient in a way that made the joke feel smaller the longer it sat in the air. Rowan Gant did not laugh. He stood near the intake counter with a clipboard he wasn't using and watched the old man set the dolly's brake, unhurried, as if the whole exchange had happened to somebody else in another room. The intake clerk, a second-class petty officer named Dillard who ran the counter like a toll booth, slid a form across without looking up. "Walk-in repairs go through base contracts now, not shop floor. You'll need an authorization number." He said it the way he said it to everyone, a policy recited so many times it had worn smooth as a river stone, and he did not seem to notice that the man in front of him had probably filed the very first version of that form. Orville read it once, folded it along a crease that suggested he'd folded that exact kind of paper before, and set it inside his coverall pocket without argument. "I'll get you the number," he said, and nothing more. And something in the plainness of it made Dillard glance up half a second too late to catch whatever expression had already passed. One of the visiting evaluators, a lieutenant commander with a laugh that arrived before his sentences did, nodded toward the canvas roll under Orville's arm and said to the room at large, "Careful. That thing's probably older than the ship." Another ripple of laughter went round, softer than the first, more curious now than cruel, the kind of laugh that is already looking for a reason to stop. Orville set the roll down at last, on a bench and not the floor, and untied the leather thong with 2 fingers that moved like they'd done this 10,000 times before, which they had. Inside lay a row of hand tools nested in their own worn slots, and among them, dulled to the color of an old coin, a brass gauge stamped with a private mark he had filed into it himself in a year most of the room hadn't been born for. He lifted it, turned it once in the light and said without looking up, "Older than the hull too, if it comes to that. Doesn't mean it's wrong." Northcott's rig chirped its clean reading again on the seam behind her, and she gestured toward the sound the way a magician gestures toward an empty hat. "With respect, sir, that reading says this hull's fine. My equipment doesn't miss 0.3 millimeters. It's not going to miss whatever you're worried about with a piece of brass and a feeling." "Might not miss what's there," Orville said, running 2 fingers slow along the seam she'd just cleared, feeling for something the light couldn't show him. "Doesn't mean it can find what isn't." Nobody in the room understood him yet. That was fine. He had not come there to be understood. He had come, as he came every spring, to fix a seam on a boat nobody else remembered the shape of. And if the room wanted to laugh at an old man's tools while he did it, he had heard worse laughter in worse rooms, from men who owed him considerably more than an apology. Dillard's rejection had cost him a form. The lieutenant commander's joke had cost him nothing at all. He answered both the same way, which was to keep working, and it was this, more than anything said in that shop that morning, that made Rowan Gant quietly move his clipboard aside and come closer to watch. Northcott had already turned back to her board, tapping the schedule with her knuckle again, moving the evaluation along, when Orville spoke without being asked to. "There's a bead missing," he said, "about 4 inches in from the transom weld on the inside face. Your line ran clean because it's reading the outside skin. Nothing wrong with the outside skin." She turned, and for the first time that morning, the smile did not come with her. "My rig scanned the full seam inside and out and posted 0.31 across the entire run. If there were a void, it would register as a variance." "Not a void," Orville said. "An absence. Different thing to look for." He set 2 fingers against the seam, not pressing, more like a man resting a hand on a shoulder to feel whether someone was breathing. "Sealant goes in wet. Cure's uneven if it's shorted even a little, and a laser reading the surface won't know the difference between a full bead gone hard and a half bead gone thin, because both of them look flat from where your light's standing. You're measuring what's there. This is measuring what isn't. The room had gone quieter than a joke deserved. Northcott folded her arms, more amused now than convinced, the posture of someone deciding whether a correction is worth dignifying. That's a lovely theory for a man with no instrument. I have telemetry logs going back to this rig's last 4 calibrations. What do you have? 40 years of hulls, Orville said, and hands that remember what a full bead feels like versus a short one. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The shop had already quieted around him the way a held breath settles a room before anyone admits they're waiting on something. And a license, or a certification, or anything at all that says I should take your word over a rig that's never been wrong on this base, Northcott said, and there was an edge now, thin as wire, the sound of someone who has begun, without quite noticing, to argue with more force than the moment requires. Who exactly are you to be telling me my own equipment's blind? Orville looked at her and then past her, at the 10 men seated in the folding chairs along the wall who had been there the whole time in plain civilian jackets, quiet the way professionals are quiet when they are simply watching someone else's demonstration. He set the brass gauge down on the bench, careful, the way a man sets down something he has carried a long way. "Spear 6, he said. 2 words would have been easier to dismiss. 1 word left nowhere to stand. The 10 men in the folding chairs rose to their feet as a single motion, chairs scraping back across the concrete in a ragged chord, every spine straightening the way a spine straightens when a body remembers something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. Northcott's mouth stayed open on whatever she had been about to say next, and nothing came out of it. Dillard's pen stopped moving mid-signature. Rowan Gant did not stand because he did not yet know he was supposed to, but he felt the floor of the room shift under him all the same, the particular vertigo of watching 10 decorated instructors treat a stooped man in faded coveralls like something between a superior officer and a myth walking around on 2 ordinary legs. Nobody explained it. That was the strange part, the part that would take the rest of the week to unpack. The evaluators simply stood there at attention in front of a boat repair bench, while an old man with a bad shoulder picked his brass gauge back up and returned, without ceremony, to running his fingers along a seam that a $100,000 laser rig still insisted was sound. Northcott recovered faster than anyone expected of her, which was, in its own way, the first honest thing the room learned about her competence that morning. She did not apologize. She did not ask who had trained 10 SEAL instructors to snap to their feet at 2 words. She turned instead to the folder she'd carried in under her arm since the demonstration began, the one everyone had assumed held nothing but calibration certificates, and drew from it a single sheet, yellowed at the corner, stamped with a filing date that put it decades before anyone currently on that shop floor had enlisted. "Before this goes any further," she said, and her voice had lost its performance now, gone flatter, more careful. "I think the board should see this. It's a decommissioning memo from 1969. It documents a river trial failure on a support craft, and it names the repair log responsible." She set it on the bench, not far from where the brass gauge lay. The log in question was filed under a repairman's initials, OF. The shop went quiet in a different register than before, the quiet of people doing arithmetic they didn't want to do. Orville looked at the memo without picking it up. "That boat failed its trial because the hull had been improperly resealed prior to deployment," Northcott read aloud, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water, "resulting in structural compromise during operational use. Responsible party, repair technician, initials OF, Cutter Bend Maintenance Detachment." She looked up. "That's a 55-year-old record naming a failure attributable to your own work. If that's accurate, it rather changes the weight of a single word from a man in a boat shop." "It's not accurate," Orville said. 3 words, no more, and he did not reach for the memo to defend himself against it, which some in the room would later say was the thing that unsettled them most. The colonel who commanded the evaluation board was not there to hear any of it. Colonel Austin Westbrook had been due at Cutter Bend an hour earlier, but a base-wide lockdown drill, sprung without warning by the security office 2 buildings over, had sealed every gate on the installation for the better part of 90 minutes, and his convoy sat idling behind a barrier arm, while radios crackled about a drill nobody had bothered to schedule around a colonel's calendar. By the time the gates lifted, the contract office had already done what contract offices do under pressure: move the vote. Friday noon, not Saturday morning, to close the books before the fiscal year turned over, and a memo to that effect had gone out to every relevant inbox while Westbrook's driver sat drumming his fingers on a steering wheel a mile from where he was needed. That left the shop with less than a day and a document that, on its face, made an old man look like the reason a Navy vessel had failed a river trial in 1969. Rowan Gant, watching Orville's face for some flicker of the outrage the moment seemed to call for, and finding none, decided he could at least do something useful with his hands. He remembered, or thought he remembered, that repair logs predating the current filing system were kept in the evidence storage annex behind the paint locker, organized by hull number, and he went there at a run, certain he could bring back the original record and settle the whole business inside the hour. What he brought back, 40 minutes later, breathless and sure of himself, was the wrong roll. It was canvas, tied with a leather thong, the same vintage as Orville's own, pulled from a bin 2 shelves below the one he should have checked, and it held not tools but a set of disciplinary write-ups from the same maintenance detachment, one of them bearing, in faded carbon ink, the initials OF, beside a note about repeated deviation from prescribed sealant procedure. He set it on the counter in front of Northcott before he'd thought it through, wanting to be helpful, wanting more than anything to hand somebody in that room a fact that would make things simpler. It did the opposite. Northcott's eyes moved down the page, and for the first time since the 2 SEALs had risen to their feet, something like relief crossed her face. The relief of a woman handed exactly the ammunition she had, moments before, seemed unsure she still wanted. "Deviation from prescribed procedure," she said, quiet, almost to herself, and then louder, to the board. "That's not a laser rig being blind to an absence, Mr. Fenno. That's a documented history." Rowan realized, a half-second too late, what he had just done, and the color left his face the way it leaves a man who has just watched his own hand do the damage his mouth never intended. Colonel Austin Westbrook came through the bay doors without an aide, without an announcement, still in the same uniform he'd worn sitting behind a barrier arm for 90 minutes, and he crossed the shop floor in a way that made every other conversation stop before he'd said a single word. He did not go to the evaluation board first, and he did not go to Northcott. He went to the bench where the brass gauge lay, looked at it for a long moment, and then looked at Orville Fenno the way a man looks at a door he has spent 31 years walking past without opening. He took off his cover. He did not salute, did not bark a greeting, only held the cap in both hands the way a man holds something he is no longer sure he's allowed to wear in this particular room, and he said, "You kept the mark on it, the private tolerance stamp. I remember you cutting that into the brass the winter before the extraction, and telling me a gauge that lies to you is worse than no gauge at all." "Still true," Orville said. "That memo," Westbrook said, turning at last to the yellowed sheet still sitting on the bench, "is a lie somebody else told." He did not raise his voice, but something under it had gone hard as a keel. "I know, because I was on the river the night the tag it's built on was written, and I was 21 years old, and I was not the man filling out paperwork. I was the man you pulled out of a mined channel with one working hand and a knife between your teeth, because the boat I was riding in had a hull seam sealed with a substitute compound some procurement officer had swapped in 6 months earlier to save 11 cents a linear foot, and it opened under pressure exactly where a proper bead should have held." The shop had gone silent in the particular way a room goes silent when it understands, all at once, that it has been standing on a floor built over something none of its own instruments could see. Northcott did not speak. Her hand, still resting on the memo, went still against the paper, not gripping it anymore, simply resting there, as if the document had become heavier than it looked. "The failure that memo blames on repair technician OF," Westbrook said, "happened because someone above him ordered a cheaper sealant substituted into the supply chain that spring, and needed a name to put on the failure that wasn't his own. It's taken me 31 years and a lockdown drill to walk into the one room that still had the man who actually filed the true tag standing in it. He looked at Orville, and something in his jaw worked once before he trusted himself to go on. I've had officers under my own command cite that memo as precedent twice in the last decade, recommending exactly the kind of contract you're proposing, Ms. Northcott, without any of us knowing whose name we were standing on to get there. Northcott looked down at the disciplinary write-up Rowan had carried in, then at the memo, then, finally, at the brass gauge on the bench between them, and something in her posture changed that had nothing to do with rank. "I didn't write this," she said, quiet now. None of the performance left in it at all. "I inherited it. It's cited in 3 procurement files I used to build my own recommendation. I never asked who OF was. I never asked why the log didn't match the tolerance stamps on record for that hull." She looked up. "I asked the rig. I never asked the record." The noon deadline sat 2 hours off now, close enough that Rowan could hear the base clock tower in the silence between sentences, and nobody in the shop had yet found the one piece of paper that could turn a colonel's testimony from a moving account into a documented fact. Orville looked toward the back shelf, past the surplus fasteners nobody had catalogued, at the tin ledger box that had not been opened in 11 years, and for the first time that day, something in his stillness had the shape of a man bracing to lift something heavy. Rowan brought the ledger box down from the shelf himself this time, careful with it in a way he hadn't been with the tool roll, setting it on the counter like it might still be able to feel the difference. The hasp gave without resistance, rusted open long before any of them had thought to check it, and inside lay years of receipts and invoices in a hand nobody in the room recognized, tidy rows of numbers running back decades, organized not by hull, not by date, but by some private logic that took Orville a full minute of turning pages to remember he had never been taught. "My wife kept these books," he said, and it was the first time he had said her name's absence out loud all day without being asked to. "Twyla. 40 years she kept every tag I ever filed in order, and I never once had to go looking for one because she'd already put it where it needed to be before I knew I'd need it." He turned another page, slow, the fixed shoulder holding steady while the rest of him bent forward over the box. "The 1 year nobody could find the tag on that 1969 job wasn't the year I misfiled it. It was the year she filed something under her own system instead of mine, and never told me, because she didn't think it mattered which drawer held the truth, so long as it was held somewhere." He found it 3 pages later, filed not under the hull number stamped into the boat's frame, but under a date, the 14th of March, in a column she had labeled, in handwriting gone soft at the edges with age, simply as jobs that mattered. The tag itself was smaller than Rowan expected, a strip of cardstock with a string hole punched through one corner, and on it, in ink that had gone the color of tea, a full accounting of the sealant used, the batch number, and a note in Orville's own younger hand. Substitute compound refused. Original spec applied per verbal order. Procurement notified twice. Northcott read it without being asked to. Nobody handed it to her. She simply came around the counter and looked, and when she straightened again, she did not reach for the disciplinary write-up or the decommissioning memo. She picked up both of those instead, folded them together, and held them out to Colonel Westbrook. "This should have been in every file I built my case on," she said. "It wasn't, because nobody who wrote those memos wanted it to be. I'm not going to be the one who finishes what they started." She looked at Orville, and there was nothing left in her face of the woman who had waved him off the shop floor that morning. "I'll withdraw the recommendation myself, before the vote." Orville only nodded, the smallest motion, and set the true tag down beside the brass gauge on the bench, the two of them lying together for the first time in 55 years, one metal and stamped, one paper and penned, both of them proof of the same quiet refusal to let a cheaper thing stand in for the right one. Twyla kept every one of his tags in order for 40 years, and the one time nobody could find, he says, was the 1 year she wasn't the one filing. The board vote convened at 11 that morning instead of noon, moved up again, this time by Colonel Westbrook's own order, and it took the room 14 minutes to strike Northcott Maritime Solutions' recommendation from the docket and enter in its place a formal correction to the base's 1969 maintenance record, restoring credit for the disputed repair to the technician who had actually performed it and naming, for the first record in 55 years, the procurement decision that had caused the failure instead. The hull repair shop kept its 4 apprentices, its hand tools, and its back shelf of surplus fasteners nobody had ever bothered to catalog, and nobody suggested outsourcing it again that fiscal year. Northcott did not disappear from the base the way Rowan half expected she might, chastened into some quiet resignation. She stayed through the transition, and 3 weeks later, when a hull came in with a seam her rig cleared clean on the first pass, she set the laser down before finishing the report, walked the seam herself with 2 fingers the way she had watched an old man do it, and wrote alongside the calibration numbers a line that had never once appeared in one of her files before. Confirmed by hand, absence checked, sealant intact. It was a small thing. It changed how every hull that came through that shop afterward got signed off. And that was not a small thing at all. Colonel Westbrook came back to the shop twice more before the season turned, neither time in uniform, and the second time he brought nothing but a folding chair he set up near the workbench and sat in for the better part of an afternoon, watching Orville run a bead of sealant into a seam with the same unhurried economy he'd used dragging a dolly across gravel months before. Neither man said much. They did not need to. Some debts get repaid in the fact of showing up and staying quiet in the same room. Rowan Gant kept his enlistment record clean in the end, the near miss with the wrong tool roll noted nowhere but in his own memory, and he took to spending his lunch hour by Orville's bench more often than the mess hall, not asking questions so much as watching where the old man's hands went next. In the fall, when the John boat came back into the shop for what both men understood, without saying so, might be the last of these spring visits, Orville did not haul it out again once the seam was set. He carried the brass hull seam gauge to the back shelf instead, lifted the lid of Twila's tin ledger box, and laid it down inside, beside the corrected tag pinned now to the box's inner lid, where anyone opening it in the next 50 years would see it first. He closed the lid slow, the way a man closes a door on a room he intends to leave standing exactly as it was, and did not open it again that day. Some records only get corrected because somebody loved you enough to file them right the first time, and on the back shelf of a small boat shop on a bend of a tidal river, a brass gauge and a paper tag sat together at last, at rest, in the order she had always meant for them to be found.